Ethan Walker spent most of his life trying to earn something that should have come naturally from the people who brought him into the world: love, respect, and approval. As a child, he believed that if he worked harder, behaved better, and achieved more than anyone expected, his parents would finally see him the way they saw his younger brother, Ryan. But year after year, that moment never came. Ryan was always the center of attention in the Walker household. If Ryan got average grades, his parents celebrated. If Ethan earned top marks, they barely looked up from the dinner table. When Ryan quit activities after a few weeks, excuses were made for him. When Ethan dedicated himself to something and succeeded, his accomplishments were treated as ordinary. At first, Ethan convinced himself it was all in his imagination. He told himself that parents loved their children equally and that one day everything would balance out. But as he grew older, the difference became impossible to ignore. His parents constantly praised Ryan while criticizing Ethan. They spent money helping Ryan recover from one mistake after another while expecting Ethan to solve his own problems. Every birthday, every holiday, every family gathering seemed to remind him where he stood. Despite the hurt, Ethan never stopped trying. He graduated at the top of his class, earned a business degree, and returned home when his father asked for help with the family business. For nearly 10 years, Ethan poured his energy into the company. He worked long hours, sacrificed weekends, and helped transform a struggling operation into a successful enterprise. Clients trusted him, employees respected him, and profits steadily increased. Deep down, he hoped that his dedication would finally earn his parents' appreciation. Instead, he watched them continue to make excuses for Ryan, who rarely showed interest in the business and often created problems that others had to fix. Whenever Ethan suggested giving employees raises or investing in growth, his parents listened carefully. Whenever Ryan proposed reckless ideas, they acted as if he were a genius. Ethan swallowed his frustration because he loved his family and believed loyalty mattered. Then came the day that shattered everything. While reviewing financial records for the company, Ethan noticed several unusual transfers. At first he assumed they were accounting errors, but the deeper he looked, the more disturbing the truth became. His parents had quietly moved ownership shares, property holdings, and major assets into Ryan's name. Some of the transfers had been happening for years. The business Ethan helped build was being handed to his brother piece by piece without anyone bothering to tell him. When Ethan confronted his parents, he expected shock or at least an explanation. Instead, he was met with cold indifference. His father told him that Ryan would eventually need the support more. His mother said Ethan had always been independent and capable of taking care of himself. Neither seemed concerned about the betrayal. Neither apologized. The message was painfully clear: Ryan would always come first. Ethan left that conversation feeling as though the ground beneath him had disappeared. For weeks he struggled to accept what had happened. He replayed every sacrifice he had made and every moment he had ignored the warning signs. Eventually he realized that no amount of effort would ever change how his parents viewed him. He could spend the rest of his life chasing their approval and never receive it, so he made the hardest decision he had ever made. He packed his belongings, moved to another city, and cut off all contact. No dramatic farewell. No angry speeches. Just silence. The first few months were incredibly difficult. He often stared at his phone, wondering if his parents would call to apologize or ask him to come home. They never did. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. The silence from his family spoke louder than any words ever could. Slowly, Ethan began building a new life. He found meaningful work, made genuine friends, and discovered what it felt like to be valued for who he was rather than compared to someone else. The pain never completely disappeared, but it became easier to carry. After 2 years of no contact, Ethan had finally started believing that the worst chapter of his life was behind him. He had no idea that a single envelope waiting in his mailbox was about to change everything. 2 years had passed since Ethan Walker walked away from his family, and during that time he had done everything possible to rebuild himself. The wounds left by his parents had not completely healed, but they no longer controlled his life. He had created a routine, focused on his career, and surrounded himself with people who respected him. Most importantly, he had learned to stop expecting anything from his parents. Their silence had become a permanent part of his reality. There were no birthday calls, no holiday messages, and no attempts to repair the relationship. At first that realization had hurt deeply, but eventually he accepted it. If they could live without him, then he would learn to live without them. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Ethan returned home from work carrying a bag of groceries. The weather outside was gloomy, and water dripped from his jacket as he stepped into his apartment building. He checked his mailbox out of habit and noticed a large envelope among the usual bills and advertisements. At first he almost ignored it, but then he saw the return address. His stomach tightened instantly. The envelope had been sent by a law office he recognized immediately. It was the same firm that had handled legal matters for his parents for years. For several seconds he simply stared at it. Countless thoughts raced through his mind. Had something happened to one of his parents? Was there some legal issue involving the family business? Why would a lawyer contact him after 2 years of complete silence? The questions followed him all the way to his apartment. He placed the groceries on the kitchen counter and sat at the table with the envelope in front of him. He wasn't sure if he even wanted to open it. The sight of his family's lawyer brought back memories he had spent years trying to bury. Memories of disappointments, broken trust, and the painful realization that he would never matter as much as Ryan. For nearly 10 minutes the envelope remained unopened while Ethan wrestled with his emotions. Finally, he took a deep breath and carefully tore it open. Inside were several pages of legal documents along with a formal letter. As he began reading, confusion quickly turned into disbelief. The letter explained that his parents had recently reviewed their estate plans and wanted Ethan to sign documents acknowledging certain asset transfers and waiving any future claims against family holdings. The language was professional, cold, and detached. There was no personal note from his parents, no apology, no explanation, no attempt to reconnect, just legal paperwork. Ethan continued reading, and each page made him angrier. According to the documents, his parents had transferred even more assets to Ryan over the past 2 years. Properties, investment accounts, and additional ownership interests had all been moved under his brother's control. It was as if they were determined to ensure Ryan received everything while Ethan received nothing. What hurt most wasn't the money, it was the complete lack of humanity behind it. After 2 years of silence, the first communication they sent wasn't a message asking how he was doing. It wasn't an invitation to talk. It wasn't an effort to heal the family. Instead, they had contacted him only because they wanted legal protection. They wanted his signature. They wanted him to quietly step aside while they finalized plans that favored Ryan yet again. Ethan felt a familiar bitterness rising inside him. He remembered all the years he had spent helping the family business grow. He remembered late nights at the office while Ryan was out enjoying himself. He remembered believing that hard work and loyalty would eventually matter. Looking at the documents spread across his table, he realized how foolish that hope had been. To his parents, he had always been useful but never important. He pushed his chair back and stood up, packing across the room. Part of him wanted to throw the papers into the trash and forget they existed. Another part wanted to call the lawyer and tell him exactly what he thought about the entire situation. But before making any decision, Ethan forced himself to calm down and continue reading every page carefully. Years of business experience had taught him that details mattered. People often hid important information in places they assumed nobody would examine closely. So he sat back down and began reviewing the documents line by line. At first everything appeared routine. Legal descriptions of assets, dates of transfers, references to trusts and ownership structures. Then he noticed something strange. Attached to the packet was a collection of records that seemed unrelated to the main purpose of the letter. Several pages referenced an older trust agreement established decades earlier. Ethan frowned and flipped back through the documents. The trust name sounded familiar, but he couldn't immediately remember why. Curious, he continued reading. The further he went, the more puzzled he became. The records contained information that didn't seem connected to Ryan's inheritance at all. In fact, they appeared to describe a completely separate financial arrangement. Ethan leaned forward and examined the pages more carefully. What he discovered next would completely change the way he viewed the envelope sitting on his table. The anger that had consumed him moments earlier slowly gave way to confusion, curiosity, and eventually something else entirely. By the time he reached the final page, a small smile had begun forming on his face. For the first time since opening the envelope, he wasn't thinking about what his parents had taken from him. He was thinking about what they had accidentally revealed. And as the realization started to sink in, Ethan knew that this unexpected letter might become the greatest gift his family had ever given him. Ethan sat motionless at the kitchen table, staring at the final pages of the legal packet. For several moments he wondered if he had misunderstood what he was reading. He picked up the documents again and carefully reviewed every line. The information remained exactly the same. Hidden among the paperwork his parents' lawyer had sent was a collection of records relating to a trust established by his grandfather more than 20 years earlier. At first the legal language seemed confusing, But as Ethan continued reading, the meaning became impossible to ignore. The trust had been created specifically for him, not for the family, not for Ryan, not for both brothers equally. It belonged solely to Ethan. His grandfather had established it shortly before his death, and according to the documents, the trust had been professionally managed ever since. What shocked Ethan even more was the value listed in the financial summaries attached to the file. The original amount had grown dramatically over the years through investments, property appreciation, and accumulated earnings. The total was so large that Ethan checked the number 3 separate times. Millions of dollars. Real money. Life-changing money. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. His heart was racing. For years he had believed that he had walked away from everything connected to his family. He thought his parents had successfully ensured that Ryan would inherit all meaningful assets while Ethan was left with nothing. Yet here, buried inside the documents they had sent, was proof that a fortune existed beyond their control. Ethan's grandfather had apparently structured the trust in a way that prevented anyone else from claiming ownership. The more he read, the more astonishing the situation became. His parents were not trustees. Ryan had no authority over it. The family business wasn't connected to it. In fact, the trust legally belonged to Ethan alone. The realization slowly settled over him like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. For years he had carried the weight of betrayal. He remembered every sacrifice he had made for the family business, every holiday where he felt invisible, every conversation where Ryan's needs mattered more than his own. He remembered the day he discovered the asset transfers and how devastated he felt when his parents showed no regret. He had spent countless nights wondering why he was never enough for them. Yet now, sitting alone in his apartment, he understood something that made him laugh softly. Despite all their efforts to favor Ryan, they had never truly controlled his future. As Ethan continued reviewing the paperwork, another detail caught his attention. The attached records suggested that the trust had generated annual reports for years. Notices had apparently been mailed to an old address connected to the family home. Whether through negligence, carelessness, or deliberate concealment, Ethan had never received them. He wasn't sure if his parents knew the trust had grown to such an enormous value. Maybe they assumed it was insignificant, maybe they forgot about it entirely, or maybe they believed Ethan would never discover it. Whatever the reason, their attempt to protect Ryan had accidentally exposed information they never intended to share. The irony was almost unbelievable. They had sent him documents expecting him to surrender potential claims to family assets, yet those same documents revealed an inheritance far greater than anything they were trying to keep from him. Ethan stood and walked to the window. Rain continued falling outside, but for the first time that day he barely noticed it. He felt lighter than he had in years, not because of the money itself, although the amount was undeniably extraordinary. The real relief came from understanding that his worth had never depended on his parents' approval. They had spent decades making him feel second best, as though his value existed only in comparison to Ryan. This discovery shattered that belief. His grandfather had seen something in him long ago. Someone in the family had believed he deserved a future of his own. Someone had cared enough to ensure he would have opportunities regardless of what happened later. Ethan thought about calling someone but decided against it. Instead, he contacted an independent attorney the following morning and arranged a private meeting. Over the next several weeks, every detail was verified. The trust was real. The assets were real. The value was even higher than Ethan initially estimated. His attorney confirmed that no member of his family had legal access to it. Everything belonged exclusively to him. The news felt surreal. While Ryan controlled the assets their parents had transferred, Ethan possessed something far more valuable: complete financial freedom. Months of bitterness began melting away. He no longer felt cheated. He no longer felt jealous. In fact, he felt strangely grateful. If his parents had never sent the legal packet, he might have remained unaware of the trust for years. Their attempt to secure Ryan's future had accidentally secured his own. One evening, after another meeting with his attorney, Ethan returned home carrying updated financial reports. He sat at the same kitchen table where he had first opened the envelope and looked at the numbers one final time. Then he imagined the chain of events that had brought him here. 2 years of silence. One unexpected letter, one careless mistake hidden inside a stack of legal paperwork. The entire situation was so absurd, so perfectly ironic that he could no longer contain himself. A chuckle escaped his lips, then another. Within seconds he was laughing harder than he had laughed in years. It wasn't the bitter laughter of someone seeking revenge. It was the laughter of a man who had finally seen the truth. His parents spent decades choosing Ryan. They sent legal documents expecting obedience. Instead, they accidentally revealed that the son they overlooked had become the wealthiest person in the family, and that realization was absolutely priceless. The months that followed were unlike anything Ethan Walker had ever experienced. After confirming every detail of the trust with his attorney and financial advisors, he made a decision that surprised even himself. He would not confront his parents. He would not call Ryan. He would not send angry letters or demand explanations. For years, he had imagined what he might say if he ever had the chance to expose their favoritism and make them understand the pain they had caused. But now that he finally held something they could never take away from him, the desire for confrontation disappeared. Instead, he focused on building the future he had always wanted. He invested carefully, expanded his professional opportunities, and started a business of his own. Unlike the family company he had helped build for others, this one belonged entirely to him. His experience, discipline, and leadership quickly attracted talented employees and loyal clients. The company grew steadily, and for the first time in his life, every success felt completely his. There was no parent minimizing his achievements and no brother receiving credit he had not earned. Ethan's confidence increased with every passing month. More importantly, he discovered a sense of peace that had been missing for years. He stopped measuring his worth through his family's approval and began appreciating the life he had created on his own. Meanwhile, events back home were moving in a very different direction. Ryan had inherited most of the assets their parents spent years protecting, but he lacked the patience and responsibility required to manage them. The family business that Ethan had once helped turn around began struggling under poor decisions and reckless spending. Longtime employees left. Important clients took their business elsewhere. Investments failed. Problems that Ethan would have solved quickly were ignored until they became serious. At first, his parents blamed the economy, competitors, and bad luck. Eventually, however, reality became impossible to deny. The business was collapsing. Financial pressure mounted, debts increased, and valuable assets were sold to keep operations alive. News of the company's troubles eventually reached Ethan through mutual acquaintances. He listened politely but felt no satisfaction. Years earlier, he might have celebrated the downfall of the people who had hurt him. Now he simply viewed it as the consequence of choices they had made. One evening, nearly a year after receiving the lawyer's letter, Ethan's phone rang unexpectedly. The number was familiar. For a moment he stared at the screen without answering. It was his mother, the first direct contact in more than 3 years. After several rings, he picked up. The conversation was awkward from the beginning. His mother asked how he was doing and spoke as though the years of silence had never happened. Eventually, the real reason for the call emerged. The family was facing serious financial difficulties. The business was close to failure. Ryan was overwhelmed. They needed help. As Ethan listened, he felt strangely calm. There was no anger in his voice and no desire to punish anyone. When his mother finished speaking, he quietly asked a simple question. "Why didn't you call during the last 3 years?" The silence that followed felt endless. No answer came. There was nothing she could say. The truth hung between them. They had not reached out because they missed him. They had reached out because they needed something. Ethan thanked her for calling and wished the family well. Then he ended the conversation. Over the following weeks, similar attempts were made by both parents and eventually Ryan himself. Each time the message was essentially the same. They wanted assistance. They hoped Ethan would step in and solve problems just as he always had in the past. But the old Ethan no longer existed. He had spent years carrying responsibilities that should never have been his. He had sacrificed enough. Instead of rescuing them, he continued focusing on his own life. A few months later, Ethan attended a business conference where he was invited to speak about entrepreneurship and leadership. Standing before a large audience, he reflected on how far he had come. Not once did he mention his family. Not once did he discuss betrayal or inheritance. Those things no longer defined him. After the event, he returned to his beautiful home. A place he had purchased with his own success and careful planning. As he sat on the balcony watching the sunset, an email notification appeared on his phone. It was from his parents' lawyer. Curious, Ethan opened the message. The lawyer was requesting clarification regarding several old family documents. At the bottom of the email was a polite note expressing surprise at the recent discovery of Ethan's grandfather's trust and its extraordinary value. Ethan smiled as he read the words. Without that original packet of paperwork, he might never have learned the truth. The document intended to remove him from the family legacy had accidentally revealed the greatest gift he would ever receive. He leaned back in his chair and laughed once more, just as he had the day he first uncovered the secret. It was not the laughter of revenge or cruelty. It was the laughter of freedom. His parents had spent decades believing they were deciding his future. They chose favorites, divided assets, and assumed they knew which son would succeed. In the end, life delivered a lesson none of them expected. The son they overlooked became the strongest, happiest, and most successful of them all. And the sweetest revenge was not watching them fail. The sweetest revenge was living so well that their approval no longer mattered. As the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, Ethan closed his phone, smiled peacefully, and looked toward the future. For the first time in his life, everything ahead belonged entirely to him.